Before I start, I want to thank the mayor for acknowledging territory and for pointing out like whose land I'm on right now, because I didn't know all that, and I really should know that if I was going to come here and speak. So I appreciate that. So my name's Daniel Taselli. I'm Dene. I'm from Radili Ko, which is known as Fort Good Hope on the map. I'm a lawyer. I'm the chief negotiator for my community's self-government negotiations. I'm the chair of the board of the Water Protector Legal Collective, and I'm also on probation. It's true. I was charged by the state of North Dakota with felony reckless endangerment and 3 misdemeanors in September of 2016. And this was for direct action that I engaged in as part of an effort to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. And that's what I want to talk about. I believe I was referred to as a legal scholar. I'm more of a reluctant participant in the wage economy, but direct action and actually asserting Indigenous sovereignty, climate justice, environmental justice, that's what I'm passionate about. That's what I enjoy doing. And so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. So most people think when you get arrested for trying to stop a pipeline, it's because you chained yourself to equipment, and that's not true. We don't use chains. It'll be way too easy for the police to cut. So instead, we use a steel tube or box. We call it a lock box. You put your arms right in there so that when they cut you out, they have to be careful to not cut off your arm. Hopefully, that's not legal advice. At your own risk. So the goal with that kind of action is to hold space for time. You're disrupting construction for as long as possible. And that's a physical intervention at a physical point. It's, we refer to that as a point of destruction, so that's where they're actually digging up the earth. So that's the same kind of tactic could be used at an open pit mine, logging operations. And there are other points of physical intervention. There's a point of production, that would be factories, bitumen upgrading facilities, oil refineries. There's also the point of consumption. So that would be your shopping malls, grocery stores, even a gas station pump. That's where the consumer actually purchases the product that is being produced. And there is the point of decision. So that would be a legislature or a parliament or even a shareholder meeting. And these are the physical spaces where decisions are being made about things like extraction, production, consumption, and whether or how those activities proceed. So those are all physical points of strategic intervention, and those are places where activities can be disrupted and behavior and decisions can be influenced. But what's more interesting to me is the non-physical points of intervention. So in our strategizing in the work that I do, we always consider this, and we always consider what we call the point of assumption. And I'll get back to that, but that's because we do this because we use a framework called story-based strategy. And so under this framework, everything is a story. And everything is analyzed as a story. And those stories are deconstructed and the weak points are identified and strategically targeted. The story itself is disrupted. So as people, we're inherently conditioned to view the world as stories. And narrative is more influential than scientific research, legislation, or policy. And I'm sorry, I didn't know I had 2 scientists with me and a mayor. And so, but really, if fact sheets and policy papers, if those things on their own really fundamentally change the world, then the world will be a perfect place, because there's a lot of that floating around. So I'm not saying that stuff isn't valuable or necessary. I'm saying that it's not enough, and we need to look at narrative. We need to look at stories. Stories are how we learn and how we understand the world around us. So getting back to assumptions, those are an inherent part of narrative. Assumptions are integral to stories. Assumptions are the things that we need to believe in order to believe the story is true. So if I walked in here right now and I was soaking wet and I told you some big yarn about how it's raining outside and I forgot my umbrella, you might believe that, you might not, but you would have to assume that it's warm enough to rain and there's at least some clouds in the sky. Those are the assumptions you need to believe that story is true. And I wouldn't come in here and say, oh, it's 3 degrees above zero and there's exactly 7 clouds. The assumptions are usually unstated, but they're necessary to believing the story. And someone could easily show you that it's below zero or that it's a perfectly clear sky, and you would right away know that my story is false because those underlying unstated assumptions that you didn't even explicitly think about were proven to be false. So that's a dumbed down version, but that's the approach we take with direct action. We look at social discourse on subjects like climate change and fossil fuel extraction as a story. It's a story dominated by certain voices and certain interests, and that's usually government and corporate interests, and other voices are not represented. And we call that the dominant narrative. And we map out the dominant narrative and identify the key elements of that story. So obviously there's assumptions, those things you need to believe their story is true. There's also conflict, so that's the backbone of every narrative. Every good story has a conflict. And as we heard with climate change, it's often a very boring, kind of long-term conflict. Characters, who has a voice? Protagonists and antagonists, so we heard about villains in the climate change story. That's important. Imagery, there's a quote that goes, if you tell me, it's an essay. If you show me, it's a story. All good stories come with images or evoke imagery. And foreshadowing. All stories provide hints about their outcome. So if you see a gun in the first act of a movie, it's going to go off at some point in the movie. So we map out the dominant narrative and we replace it with our own narrative. And that's a narrative that highlights the conflict, that elevates the voices of characters who normally don't have a voice, and that offers foreshadowing of a future people never even thought was possible. Our story attacks the assumptions of the dominant narrative. So I'm going to end with a brief example here, and that's October 12th, 1992. And that was the first celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day. And it was also known as Columbus Day, in fact, the 500th anniversary of Columbus, allegedly discovering the continents in this hemisphere. And I don't think anyone actually still believes that Columbus discovered anything, but that cultural narrative around Columbus Day, it represents a lot. So it represents the doctrine of terra nullius, it represents the invisibilization of Indigenous peoples, and our systems of social organization, our legal orders, and our systems of governance. It masks, or worse yet, justified genocide of Indigenous peoples. It represents colonialism. So more than 2 decades of dedicated and strategic campaigning, organizing, and direct action have successfully deconstructed that narrative and replaced it with a different narrative. And that's the narrative of Indigenous Peoples Day, a narrative that makes Indigenous people a character in the story, and it's a narrative that refutes the assumption of terra nullius and refutes these underlying values of colonialism. So when we go out and do direct action, whether we're locking down to equipment, whether we're disrupting parliament, or whether we're organizing in a community center somewhere, we always think, how do our actions disrupt the story? Thank you. Merci.